Blog Talk Radio. Well, welcome to Big Blend Radio's Military Monday show, where every first Monday we get to chat with military historian Mike Guardia. He's an award-winning author, as I said, a military historian, and he's a U.S. Army veteran, and that's his music. So, we get to do a live show with him again. We're always Zoom recording, and then I got all excited. I'm like, we have the music. We get to play. So welcome, everybody. Mike has been on our show for years, and even yesterday's show. And his latest book is Danger Forward, The Forgotten Wars of General Paul F. Gorman. His 22nd book is coming out on March 25th called Combat Diaries, and we're very excited about it. And cool. Lately, you can see Mike Guardia on the History Channel on the new series, I Was There, and it features actor Theo Wilson, and it's a really cool because he takes on, what happened in real time of major historical events, and the latest episodes feature Mike with the Johnstown flood, Chernobyl. The next one is the Battle of Stalingrad and the Oklahoma City bombing. So really check it out, and if you missed the live shows, you can go to history.com and find it there, and again, it's called I Was There. Today's show, we are going to be talking about prisoner of war camps, especially during World War II and the Vietnam War. So to keep up with everything with Mike, go to MikeGuardia.com. But welcome back, Military Mike. How are you?
Hey, ladies. I'm doing great. Always good to be on the show.
Cool. Hey, it's been 24 hours? Not even, right? Yeah.
Yesterday's right, pretty much.
Show. Wow, that was quite a conversation. Who knew the Toast to Women show would get into so much military history? But we're going to talk about prisoner of war camps. I'm glad we're talking about this. And Nancy and I just went to one in a town called Princeton in Texas, in North Texas. It's just outside Salina, about an hour and a half north of Dallas, I think. But we were there. All I know is we were there. And they had this, big water tower, and apparently this prisoner of war camp used to be a migrant workers camp. And then during World War II, they didn't have the workers, the farmers didn't have the workers. So they put them in the migrant worker camp, the German POWs. So they were all German. And the farmers would come in early morning, pick them up, and take them out, and they would do a lot of the regular farming, harvesting, planting. They did stone masonry around town. They even built what is now part of the park where this the plaque is of where they were. And then, after the war, then, the workers came back and they moved on. So they were there for about a year, but I didn't realize that this is kind of a common practice across the country, that these camps were settled in labor camps initially, and that they were even getting paid to work. I think it was like $2 a day to work. So I didn't even know any of this. So I'm so glad we're talking about it. So because that wasn't a normal thing, right, that people would get paid.
No. Not normal by any means, but, in a broader sense, I really think that underscores the difference in how Americans have traditionally run their POW camps versus how a lot of other places in the world have been running theirs, both before and after the Geneva Convention. It highlights how we appreciate the dignity of the prisoners that we take in, even if we do push the bounds of how we extract information from them, you still can rely on a lot more humane treatment if you're in American custody versus the custody of a foreign military anywhere else in the world.
I think that's true. Yeah, well, I remember my mother talking about when she was in school, they came and collected all the Japanese children out of her school. And that they were extremely polite, and none of the kids in the classroom really understood what was happening until their parents told them later. The school made it look like all these lucky kids are going to go on a field trip or something. So even the kids weren't upset. They're just like, oh, goody, And then, I don't know what happened once they were taken, completely off the school grounds, and found out later. And I don't know if the kids were reunited with their parents or how that happened. I have no idea. I just remember her saying that, she found out later that they had all been taken away, and that was that.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, pretty scary.
But that would be different, right? That would be an internment camp versus a POW camp. And so, we should look at that, because we were, right before we went on air, we were talking about concentration camps being different. So there's 3 different camps, right?
Right.
Mm.
Okay, so that's the internment. And so, like Manzanar, a National Historic Site, which is outside on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada mountains. If you go up Highway 395 by Ridgecrest, and hey, isn't that by Edwards Air Force Base? Mike, you know that area.
It's close to it, yeah.
Yeah.
So, we actually had quite a few different internment camps for Japanese Americans throughout the war. And it is a sad part of our history, but at the same time, if there is a bright side to it, we can at least objectively say that that the people who were in those camps were treated exponentially better than the people who were in the prison camps in Germany.
Sure.
Because I think a mistake that a lot of historians and a lot of social commentators have tended to make in the ensuing decades after the war was over was to try and establish some degree of moral equivalency between what the Germans were doing to the Jews in the concentration camps and what the Americans were doing to the Japanese in the internment camps. And you can't make that comparison because they're apples and oranges. I mean, neither one of them is right, but you have one that is qualitatively evil on one side happening in Germany, and something that is something that's illegal and a pain in the butt happening here in America. Because it was inexcusable for us to be doing that, but at the same time, it's like, don't say that we were treating them as poorly as what the Nazis were doing to the Jews. It's like, don't compare a thief to a jaywalker kind of thing,
Yeah, that's true. At the same time, I know that we had Japanese American people who were in our armed forces during World War II.
That's right, and that is really a testament to their character, because one of the bright spots in American military history has been the performance of the all Japanese American units that fought in Europe, the most notable of which was the 442nd Infantry Regiment, who distinguished themselves in both combats large and small, and you had more awards for valor come out of that unit per capita than any other unit that fought in the war. And these were all first-generation American-born Japanese people, who were the sons of Japanese immigrants, and they all had first names like Phil and Tommy and Joe, but their last names were Tanaka and Yamaguchi, and they were just as loyal as your everyday average neighbor next door. But because they had an ancestral connection to the country that we were fighting, they were looked upon with suspicion. And despite the fact that they had families back home who were in the relocation centers, they distinguished themselves valiantly in some pretty intense combat in Europe. So that, I think, is it's a bright spot in our history, in the sense that they were able to steel themselves and prove their loyalty to the country beyond any shadow of a doubt, while they were still suffering setbacks as far as their family's concerned.
Right.
There were also Chinese that were serving in American forces. We've actually had some authors on the show talking about their family doing that, and kind of, glanced over a lot, and also look at Native Americans, that were, fighting for our country. You got to just wow. The Navajo
That's
Code
right,
Talkers.
the Navajo Code Talkers.
Yeah. Oh, we got to do a show on them one day. That's a whole And the Tuskegee Airmen, sorry, we got to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still in that mode on them. But one thing too, talking about the Japanese, one thing that comes up in history, and I know we've talked about it on shows too, is how they ran their POW camps, their prisoner of war camps. So from what I was reading, that they said no to the Geneva Convention. So was this after, where am I on this? This was after World War II, or was this during World War II or Vietnam, when they really basically sounds like it was after that they were, from what I read, they were the worst. Like the more deaths occurred in Japan, prisoner of war camps versus any others.
Right. Well, if you start with the Geneva Convention, that was actually formalized in 1949, and the war crimes that were committed by the Axis, that was really the driving force behind the creation of the Geneva Convention. They wanted to make sure that, war, especially war being what it is, how it's never really a humanitarian pursuit, and it's never nice, it's never pretty. There are still certain bounds that you should not go beyond. And when they took a catalog of all of the war crimes that were committed by the Nazis, and they went through all of the documentation and all of the transcripts from the Nuremberg trial, and then they reconciled that against a lot of the war crimes that they had documented from the Japanese. They said, look, if there's ever a war again to any scale and any magnitude, we want to make sure that any prisoners of war or any persons who are captured or who find themselves on the wrong sides of an enemy line are treated with at least a basic level of dignity and are not subject to any of the atrocities that we have seen. And there was an initial group of nations who signed on to that, and when they became signatories to the Geneva Convention, they were expected to be bound by those rules. And if they didn't, they say, okay, well, you're going to have the same fate that befell pretty much everyone in the Nazi high command that we got a hold of. And it was after that the Geneva Convention became somewhat of a governing document, but how well countries have abided by it and how well it's been enforced, that's another question entirely.
Well, especially right now when you're looking at what's happening with Ukraine and Russia, some of the things I've read doesn't sound like Russia is part of the Geneva agreement at the moment.
Right. Yeah. And as a matter of fact, Nancy, I'm glad that you brought that up, because that reminds me of a news story that I read, I think, just not much more than beyond the last 24 hours. But Ukraine has actually sent out a clarion call for mercenaries, and they said if you are an overseas military professional and you fit the description of have gun, will travel, you can come fight for us as a mercenary, and we will pay you $60,000 a month to fight for us on a contract basis.
Wow.
Now, that's a lot of money, and there are a lot of soldiers of fortune out there who would probably be willing to take that up, but Vladimir Putin, for his part, has intercepted some of those communiques and said, look, if you are caught fighting in Ukraine and you are a mercenary and you are not a uniformed member actively serving on either side of the conflict, you will not be granted the same status that will be afforded to a prisoner of war. If we find you, we will not give you quarter, and do yourself a favor and save the last bullet for yourself.
Wow.
So he is essentially thumbing his nose at the Geneva Convention, and there's a whole slew of legal ramifications that go on with that. Can he actually do that? And is a mercenary afforded the same level of protection that a uniformed soldier would otherwise get? And, what do you do, when you're fighting partisans, or if you're fighting guerrillas, are they counted in the same category? But, so, the Geneva Conventions, while it's good to have on paper, anybody with half a brain can try to find loopholes anywhere.
But what about war crimes? Wouldn't that make Putin really guilty of war crimes? But I mean,
it would.
Does that mean anything?
Yeah, and Nancy, that's actually the $1 million question right there.
Yeah.
How much would it mean, and what body would be willing to try him? Because the international laws are only as good as the willingness to enforce them and having the tools to enforce them.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. When someone in a war situation, and obviously this is, it's a war between Russia and Ukraine, but it's really not. It's just a mass, let me try and take over, horror. But when you look at wars in the past, like World War II, Vietnam, and is Guantanamo Bay like a prisoner of war camp? What would that be actually? What is that like? What would we call that?
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the official names that it went by, if I am remembering it correctly, was a detainment center. But
let's
just call a spade a spade. I mean, really, for what it is, it is an enemy POW camp. But the key difference that would separate Guantanamo Bay from any number of facilities that you see elsewhere in the world is that, those people who are detainees, if you want to call them that, or if you do want to call them prisoners of war, or whatever politically correct term that you want to put on it, they are still given a level of care that is not afforded to those who are captured by the other side. And that's just it,
Yeah, because if you think about what was going on, that's a whole different deal. So the prisoner of war is like, what happens in like Vietnam? What if you caught someone? Okay, so then, when do you go like, hey, I grabbed you? And was the whole goal when you go into a war? Obviously, there's the killing part, but then it's like, okay, when do you go, okay, I'm going to grab someone and make them a prisoner versus take them out? Like or do you grab the people that are really the hot shots, on the other side and go, okay, we want to grab them so we can get information? Where does that whole thing come into play in war?
Well, from what I recall, the escalation of force requirements to be from when I was in the military is that you shoot at any kind of enemy personnel for as long as they are actively resisting you. So if they are likewise carrying a weapon, or if they are behind any type of any type of weapon system, then they are free game and you are authorized to kill them. Now, they can take status as a prisoner of war the moment they surrender to you. And there are any number of ways that they can make those intonations. But, it is understood that you engage them as a target for as long as they have the capacity to be a threat to you. Now, if a soldier or any type of enemy personnel has been neutralized and they no longer have a weapon and no longer have the active means to resist you, then that's when you take them into custody. But if they get combative or they try to resist, even if it's not armed resistance, then that resets the force escalation requirements and you are free to use deadly force at that point. So, whenever there has been a conflict where there has been a priority target list, it's been a list of what the preferences are for eliminating that target. If you can eliminate the target in its entirety and essentially make the person go from living to dead, that is the first priority. But if you can take them alive, and if they facilitate that by their cooperation, then we also consider that a victory, because this high-ranking person can yield some actionable intelligence that we can use at some point down the line.
Yeah, I wonder, we look at John McCain, being, prisoner of war, And wasn't he in 2 camps or something? It was, and this was before he was a politician, right? This is, way back when in Vietnam, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or was it? Yeah. That he was taken, but from what I understand, it wasn't the easiest of life, being a prisoner of war during Vietnam.
No. So he was held at the Hanoi Hilton, and he spent a good chunk of his internment there in solitary confinement. And those who get put into solitary confinement, they have a smaller cell that is barely big enough to accommodate a full-grown man standing up. And there's also minimal light that is being shined through, and it's not a pleasant experience. And they make that solitary confinement as uncomfortable as possible to either try and break the psyche of that particular prisoner or, reform whatever they think are nonconformist behavior that a POW should not have. He certainly gave his testimony to all of the less than stellar treatments that he was subjugated to. But there's no question at all that it was not a pleasant experience for him, and I don't think he ever truly recovered from the psychological scars. And if you see the footage and you see the photographs of him coming off the plane, you can tell that not only has he lost weight, but it has accelerated his aging process to that point.
Sure.
He looked much older than the time that he had otherwise spent there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you look at prisoner of war, prisoners a lot of times are really, really skinny, and it's like, skin and bones, depending on what I haven't seen that really on the American side from the footage I've seen, but definitely on the other side, and especially, the Vietnam era seemed to be one of the worst. And if you got into Japanese hands too, that they were, isn't it true that they put like bamboo shoots under your fingernails and stuff like that?
There was all forms of torture to get the information. But, then when we're sitting back here at home and you're watching things like MASH, which was a pretty funny series, I don't know how people in the military respond to it, because it kind of makes light of something that is really not a light subject at all. And maybe people think that's, how people kind of take television as the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Right.
Yeah. I wonder if people watch that and then feel that war was a big party somewhere,
Well,
I hope not.
There are probably some people who think that, but I think the older sections of the viewing audience, and I think even those who were seeing MASH back when it was on TV in its heyday, I think they saw it as Hollywood using humor to try to deal with what was otherwise a bad situation.
Yeah.
Because MASH being set in Korea, that was one of the last so-called good wars that we had. Granted, it didn't quite have the panache or the glory of World War II, but it was one where, we at least came home feeling pretty good about ourselves, and we had enough good data points to say, okay, we can call this a victory. But then you fast forward to the next decade, and you had the tragedy and really the fire show of Vietnam. That was a terrible social event for us at home, as well as being a disaster on the international stage. And I think what the formula there was to take what was otherwise not a very highly regarded institution and put a lighthearted spin on it to, on some subtle level, help the American society's collective healing process.
Mm.
Like to say, hey, we can take something like the military, who, right here in the 1970s does not have a very good reputation. We can make it funny and lighthearted. Try to think of, something like Gomer Pyle, or even the old Beetle Bailey comics. Just something that will, something that will take a humorous setup and get people to forget about some of the more unpleasant parts of the social unrest that we endured.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it was really, especially after Vietnam, there was such a divide in the country over it, and it's different now. Look at the country; everyone's agreeing that Russia is wrong. So it's one thing Putin did is got everybody to now, no matter what side of the aisle politically you are, we all know Putin is evil, But it's when you think of after Vietnam, people were anti the military, who a lot were drafted. It's not their fault that they were drafted and fought, and it was just a big mad, crazy mix. And Korea, that was something that people forget to even talk about, the Korean War. It's always Vietnam, right? But I think that Hollywood has done that really good job of bridging a gap, of making something where people can communicate again in some way and create that blur that line in the sand. And even things like, Archie Bunker, I'm sorry, it was funny, but they did it through humor, brought in serious topics. Mm-hmm. They did. Mm-hmm. If you go back and rewatch the MASH things, man, they did bring in hardcore topics. And, that's the same thing as, All in the Family, Sanford and Son even, and Moving On Up, and all of those. I could watch that forever. And Hee Haw, by the way. I will watch Hee Haw till the cows come home. I love Hee Haw. Totally off topic. But anyway, Hee Haw, I spent one New Year's Eve watching every Hee Haw. I didn't, I grew up in South Africa. I didn't know much about this stuff, but it was cool. But going back to prison of war camps, you see, we had to have a little lightheartedness here. Because it is heavy when you think about someone staying in a camp and you are completely out of control. And our day-to-day, and like you said, solitary confinement. And in some of these camps, they try to take you away from your friends, your soldier, your teammates, basically, so that you are not going to do a gang. I know that there's some pretty high-profile escapes that happened, and so you'd think that they really did want to keep you away from your soldier mates because you may plan an escape.
Yep. It is one of the unfortunate parts of warfare that you have some camp commanders and some high echelon military leaders who know a thing or two about human psychology and use the darker aspects of that to get what they want.
Mm-hmm. Well, we see that right here at home with some police. We're going through stuff right now with our police forces. Are they? People want to not have a police force, which, I don't know. I lived in Africa.
We have
to
have a
police
balance.
Force.
Well, no, but we had a corrupt police force too at one point. So, in Africa, it's different. So it's a balance in communication. I also wonder about how much training and mental health that goes into it too for all. So that's a whole other topic. Let's not get into that because Mike's in Minnesota. We don't want that. That's hard to think. That's a whole other show. But going back to prisoners of war and your new book, the Combat Diaries, which we're excited because you're really telling the stories of World War II veterans, right, and getting it on paper. Because we're losing our veterans now. They're moving on because that's what happens in age. So, and you were saying that one of them is in the book, Combat Diaries. These are all true stories. Again, was in a POW camp in World War II.
He was. As a matter of fact, he was a Minnesota National Guardsman, no less. So this one particular gentleman that I wrote about in the Combat Diaries, just an incredible story of perseverance. an incredible story of survival. Here was a man who joined the Minnesota National Guard right in the midst of the Great Depression. And he went on the record to admit that, I really only joined the National Guard because I liked the way the uniform looked. I know it would help me pick up girls at the local dances. And being that this was right in the middle of the Great Depression, I could use that extra paycheck every month. So, he goes through the training for the National Guard, and he actually finds that he takes quite well to the military lifestyle. He becomes a tank crewman, and he rises pretty quickly through the ranks. He ends up becoming a tank commander. Wow. And this is when the Minnesota National Guard was one of the few active National Guard units that had a qualifiable tank force. Well, you wind the clocks a bit forward to the end of 1940 and the dawn of 1941, and it's pretty clear to anyone who's paying attention to international events at that time that war is probably going to find the U.S. whether we like it or not. So to try to stack the deck in our favor if and when war comes, they start federalizing a lot of the National Guard units, and they say, okay, well, we want to put you guys on active duty for a while, and we're going to send you to places X, Y, and Z, and we're going to have you drill and train as an active duty unit so that if war comes, and hopefully it doesn't, knock on wood, but if it does come, then you will be ready to meet that threat. Well, about a year-long activation tour sounded pretty good in terms of any soldier's personal finances, because they would be getting active duty pay, and they would have access to all of the active duty benefits. So they activated his unit, the 194th Tank Battalion, and then they sent him all the way across the Pacific to the Philippines. Well, this was the summer of 1941, and everyone was certain that if a war was going to break out, it was going to happen in mainland Europe before it ever happened in the Pacific, because we still considered the Japanese military to be a second-rate fighting force. And the Philippines at the time offered the best of Army glamour. It was still a U.S. Commonwealth at the time. Had you had the capital city of Manila that was called the Pearl of the Orient, and you had these beautiful beaches, and it was one of the few places that soldiers were really fighting to get to. You either wanted to go to Panama or you wanted to go to the Philippines. So he's there, and he starts practicing all of the normal variety of defensive drills that would be expected for a defense of the Philippine homeland. But nobody expects the attack on Pearl Harbor, followed very quickly by an invasion of the Philippines. And given the resources that they had at the time, they were fighting a losing battle pretty much from the first day. And at one point, they actually had to abandon their tanks, because they didn't have the infrastructure points available to get those tanks to consolidate at Bataan. So here you had an entire tank battalion that didn't have any tanks, and they were having to make the retreat on foot. Well, he gets the order to surrender, and some guys in the Philippines, of course, like Russell Volkman and Don Blackburn, they refused the order to surrender, and they disappear into the jungle to raise guerrilla movements. But, other men did not escape into the jungle because all of their unit commanders said, no, if you resist and if you disobey the order to surrender, you're going to be considered a deserter, and you will be charged as such after the war. Well, that didn't deter some people, but it did scare some soldiers into saying, well, gosh, I really don't want to be labeled a deserter. So they accepted the terms of surrender, and they lived to regret their decision very quickly, because they ended up on the Bataan Death March, just like this one particular soldier did. And assuming they even survived the Death March, they had a horrible experience in the Japanese POW camps, just doing unspeakable things with no rhyme or reason. I mean, it seemed like the Japanese were torturing these American POWs simply for their own amusement. Well, this one particular soldier whose story is in the book, you know, he starts off at 2 different POW camps in the Philippines, and then at one point he's put on what's called a hell ship, and he is put on that ship and sent to the Japanese mainland to work in a different labor camp. Now, they call it the hell ship, and this is important because the living conditions aboard the ship, the best way that I can describe it is that cattle are treated better, because they were kept in these very dark cargo holds. Very often they were not fed. They had no access to bathroom facilities. So for the better part of a 2-week voyage from the Philippines to the mainland island of Honshu in Japan, you had all of these prisoners of war who were in the cargo hold, and, you know, they were walking around in ankle-high urine that was splattered with all of their own fecal matter.
Yeah.
You know, so that leads to a whole slew of health problems. You had guys coming down with dysentery, you know, guys, you know, guys who developed any number of health problems, and they died shortly after they got off the ship. Well, this one particular fellow, he survived the hell ship, and he said that he will never forget the smell for as long as he lived. And then they put him into a Japanese work camp that was on the mainland. And those work camps could vary depending on what the size and function was, but the particular one they sent him to was a camp that was built around a Japanese coal mine. And, you know, he was working a lot of the coal tracks there, but, you know, of course, these POWs are so weak and they're so frail by this point that they can hardly keep themselves upright. But here's a bright, shining moment of that story, because there was one point during his internment that he was very, very close to being on death's doorstep, and there was a Japanese foreman who was in charge of this particular junction of the coal cart track, and you know, this particular POW, he was probably on his last leg of life, but the Japanese foreman saw that the POW had a crucifix because this particular POW was a Catholic. Well, lo and behold, this Japanese foreman was one of the few Japanese Catholics that actually lived in Japan, and once he saw that he had a common thread of the Catholic faith, he took pity on the POW, kind of lifted him up and put him off to the side and gave him enough time to recover so that, you know, he could continue to do his duties. But yeah, it was weird that you had that one faint trace of humanity that was detected there. And, you know, it wasn't too long after that they got news of the bombs being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they didn't know about the bombing straight away, but they knew something was up because one of the, I want to say it was like one of the wireless lines at the camp, they had a direct terminal to Hiroshima, and then that terminal went dead because the whole town had been obliterated. And then shortly after that, the guards vacated the camp. So the POWs are sitting around and they're looking at each other like, okay, what's going on? The camp now has 0 communications and all of our guards have left. What's going on? Have we recovered from Pearl Harbor? Is the U.S. about to invade? What's going on in Europe? Nobody knew anything.
Wow.
But it wasn't but like a few days after that, that they met the first of the American envoys, you know, who said, hey guys, the war's over and we are going to bring you back home. And the happy ending to the story is that being that he was a Minnesota National Guardsman, he can say that he is one of the few POWs in history to be personally repatriated by his state commander-in-chief, because the governor of Minnesota at that time had gone over to Japan as part of the envoy to help negotiate the release of POWs, and he told one of the high-ranking Japanese officials, he said, look, you have quite a few POWs on your roster who are members of my National Guard, and they report directly to me. So I want to personally repatriate each one of these guys that you have in custody.
Wow, that's amazing, because when you even think, him working in the coal mine, you think about what coal miners go through, that entire that hard work. And there's a trust that is also, I mean, this is why we have unions for coal miners. It's one of the first, unions we had was about the health and care of the workers. And there's a trust in mining that has to happen. There's a trust that it's like going into a zone that you can die in a mine very easily. And you know that they're not being well looked after. It's like, here, go do this work. But at the same time, if you want them to work, you do need to feed them, right? But so that has had to have been absolutely horrible, going into a mine.
Oh, sure.
Because mining is select people understand it and like it, but it's a very scary, tricky craft and work. So, as a prisoner,
it's a whole different.
That's a
set
whole
up to be
other
a
world.
Punishment. Yeah.
That's creepy. I mean, you go underground like that, it's creepy. I've gone in caves, man. There's a creepiness to caves beyond the pretty stalagmites and stalactites in national parks. There's some creepiness and eeriness to it.
Thing.
No, so I think it's that part of it in itself is really crazy. And the thing too, being able to be rescued. That's something too. And when you think about the war and the communication when it was there, I mean, were they always able to, like, okay, are we waiting until the war's over, or are we already trying to get them out? You know what I mean? To be able to go and rescue, all of our people that are, POWs in the different areas around the world, literally, because it wasn't just Japan. It's different areas that our soldiers were in, right? That needed to be rescued.
Right.
So that was like a whole other segment of the war. The war may be over, but it really wasn't until everybody got home.
Right. So once they accepted the terms of surrender from Japan, it at that point became, okay, our number one priority is to account for all of our POWs and to try to get them back within our ranks as soon as possible. Because it was no secret how poorly the Japanese were treating their POWs, and they said, okay, well, the sooner that we can get to these guys, the better. And the healing process was a continuous one for all of these POWs, and this particular one, whose story appears in the book, he said that for years afterwards, hey, I still have to remind myself to forgive the Japanese. He said, he said, I've already forgiven them, but I have to re-forgive them 2 or 3 times a month because there is so much resentment and so much psychological trauma that he carries with that. I mean, the downstream effects of being treated as horribly as they were, it should make anybody give pause to see that, well, hey, gosh, you don't really accomplish anything at all when you treat your POWs in this manner,
Well, it's, and it's difficult because not every Japanese person has anything to do with what happened to him, So, but your body is, has its warning danger signals, and that is automatic. It's an automatic response to something that, if you've experienced it, like if a dog bites you and you see the same kind of dog or the same dog, you're going to pull back because your body says, hey, that's danger, So it's a normal response to that. But I can,
I wanted to touch on the Red Cross. I was reading all about the Red Cross, and this is really, isn't it, in World War II when they really became big. And, World War I is when they realized they needed some kind of they needed some kind of effort, I should say. And wasn't it World War II that they really got big in going in and helping the prisoners of war, not just, the soldiers, but they kind of had a twofold thing, the Red Cross. And still to this day, I mean, look at what's happening for Ukraine. It seems like the Red Cross has gone in every national and international drama, the situation.
Right. Yeah. Ever since the end of World War I, the International Red Cross, they have been the biggest mobile humanitarian relief effort anywhere. We can, I think we can point to the First World War as the first major conflict where they started hitting critical mass. And, they have been a good humanitarian force ever since.
And getting blood too. Apparently, that's the other thing is they really got out, and the Red Cross was about blood. And hey, listen, the American donut comes from the Salvation Army. The girls in the Salvation Army in the World War II, would go around and make donuts and serve coffee to the soldiers. There's like this whole history about the donut in World War II, and you've got it. I mean, there's so many stories, and that's what you're doing with the Combat Diaries. I think this is classic. How many soldiers have you documented in Combat Diaries?
Let's see, there are 18 in total, and they run a pretty wide gamut too. I think, every single one of them is an interesting person. But if I can just throw out a few previews. There was one who was an Army nurse, and and she really enjoyed being a nurse because she said when you were an Army nurse, you were actually in an entirely separate category from the WACs, the Women's Army Corps. And she said people tried to call us WACs, but we said no, we're actually part of the regular Army. We're not part of the Women's Army Corps. And I found her story to be incredibly poignant because at the time, there were a lot of combat restrictions on women, and it was expected that if you were a female, you were not required, nor were you permitted to fight in a forward area. But when you're a nurse in an Army mobile hospital, you have no choice but to be right there on the front lines, even if you're only 2 or 3 spaces back from it. And at these mobile hospitals that she served with, she was serving with these evacuation hospitals in places like Anzio and all throughout the Italian mainland, which were some of the worst meat grinder battles for our forces early on. Just trying to process the ever-growing list of casualties that were coming through the hospital, trying to give guys morphine, trying to assuage those who were fatally wounded and those who you knew couldn't be saved. It really took a toll on her psyche. And not only that, but while she's trying to process all these casualties and try to render the appropriate aid until a doctor is present on the scene, you also have to worry about getting the hospital tent shelled by an enemy mortar, which, she said happened more often than you might think. The bright red cross on top of our tents was visible for at least 800 meters in any direction, but that didn't always stop the Germans from trying to shell us. And there was a bit of a Machiavellian attitude towards it to say like, oh, hey, well, if there's a hospital tent, we know that if we shell it, the people inside aren't going anywhere, and that those are fewer American troops that we have to deal with.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So here's a woman. It's Women's History Month. You brought another woman on board here. Yeah. I love that. That because we forget about them being, the nurses and going through all of this. I mean, they were, weren't you always in a target zone too, as a nurse or a doctor, as because you build up a camp and everyone can see where your camp is. Aren't you more an easy target, in war because people know you've set up camp somewhere because you have to.
Yeah. Well, you're always going to be a target in a forward area. The thing is that if you have a camp or if you have a combat outpost or whatever name that you want to apply to it, it's always understood that you're going to have a security element that is going to be part of that camp to ensure that it can survive. You're always going to have guards on the perimeter. You're always going to have a fire base that is going to be at least one terrain feature behind that can, provide a rapid mortar or provide a rapid artillery suppression. And the locations of all those forward station camps, they're shared with the Air Force, and they're shared with all of the local Army aviation units, to ensure that if this particular post is in danger of being overrun, they can apply not only indirect fires, but they can, also scramble whatever tactical air assets are nearby to, stop the enemy dead in its tracks.
Yeah.
So, just being out there, you're always going to draw fire, but you have fire that you can redraw on your own.
I would always feel like I'm a sitting duck. You know what I mean? I like to be on the run.
Well, I think, but if a country does abide by the Geneva Conference, I don't know that they would target hospitals, would they? Wouldn't that be part of that? Oh.
Well, right, and technically they're not supposed to, and I know that some militaries would be better at following that than others, but anytime you have a medical apparatus, or even in the Navy, if you have a hospital ship, the hospital ships I know are always very clearly marked. They're always solid white, and there's a big red cross that you see on both the port and the starboard side of the vessel. So there is no mistaking to anyone that, hey, this is not a warship. Technically, it's a ship to accommodate the wounded. And it was kind of interesting because I can point to another story in the Combat Diaries of a soldier who was part of a naval convoy. He was on a troop ship, and they were en route to the Philippines. And the convoy itself came under a Japanese air attack. And one of the ships in front of him sustained a direct hit from a Japanese Zero. And then there was a ship on his side that received a direct hit from a kamikaze attack. And one of the things that he said that really stuck with me was that, you can read about kamikaze and you can understand the concept behind it, but when you see it in real time, it has a terrible psychological effect on you.
Wow.
Yeah. And he said when we were still under attack, one of the ships in the convoy hoisted up what they called a mercy flag. And, that's because, we didn't have any hospital ships in the convoy, but when we hoisted up a mercy flag, it was a big white flag with the red cross in it. And that was to let the Japanese know that, hey, we are not to be treated as a combatant vessel at this point. We're making circles to try to pick up the wounded who are bobbing up and down in the sea. So, there's always that element to it.
Would you pick up someone on the other side? Like, what happens, if there's people in the sea, and what happens if it's the other side in there? Would you pick them up too and then be prisoner of war in a hospital setting?
Right. Yeah. And as a matter of fact, that's what the Royal Navy did with the Kriegsmarine in a lot of those naval battles that happened in the North Atlantic. As a matter of fact, when they sank the battleship Bismarck, there were two ships, the HMS Dorsetshire, and I think the other one was the HMS King George V. Those were two ships who ran interference to pick up a lot of the German sailors who had jumped into the water. And, at that point, I think accepting the fate as a POW was probably easier for them, since they know, okay, this battleship that we were on, it was the pride of Hitler's war fleet, and now it is sinking to the bottom of the North Atlantic. We don't have a single firearm within 1,800 nautical miles. So yeah, we will gladly go aboard this Royal Navy vessel, as opposed to staying out here in the black icy waters of the North Atlantic and probably being the next meal for the shark that comes along.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking about. It's like, and it's cold as hell, man. I don't care what tropical waters you are. There's a time when it gets cold. Well, and you just even think of Battle of Normandy, right? And like you see them out there in heck no. Like, European waters are not warm and friendly. That's not no. And you're getting out in there in the cold, and then like in other parts of the world, you've got sharks. think about it. You're off of the coast, the Pacific coast. Dude, there's sharks out there.
Yeah, but
maybe even a whale or two that might just, fling you up in the water. But and if you're wounded, you're bleeding, so you are shark bait. I mean, that's just no, and that's creepy too. When you get that's a creepy way. It's like the coal mine. Now we've got the deep waters of the ocean, and there's creepy things under there.
And then, how are you going to feed yourself? You're going to swim after, catch a raw fish?
You have to tread water. And if you're wounded and treading water, I mean,
there's
at least
only
salt
so
water
many
is
out.
healing, but like that's just, I'm freaking myself out on this whole thing of what can happen. So it's Combat Diaries. I'm excited for that to come out again, everyone, March 25th. You can pre-order on Amazon. Go to MikeGuardia.com for that. But just in closing here, I want to do a thing on the escape attempts. So Nancy, in Arizona, Papago Park, we've actually talked about them on shows before, talking about Arizona cooking. Actually, they have a cookbook, and there's a museum and a park there. This was a POW camp, and it was the largest escape to occur from an American facility, apparently. The German POWs tried to get out, and apparently we had Italian POWs in this country. We had, a whole bunch going on.
Yeah.
But, Nancy, going back to where we lived in Kenya, I was reading, so it's a Wikipedia thing, so don't come at me if it's wrong. But apparently there are these, I think it's Italian, Giovanni and Belletto and Vincenzo, Felice Benuzzi. They escaped Camp 354 in Nanyuki, Kenya, and decided they're going to climb Mount Kenya. And apparently there's a whole thing called, they recorded it saying "No Picnic on Mount Kenya." It's the Bear Mountain Picnic by Bob Dylan. No, but anyway, no picnic on Mount Kenya, and apparently they tried to do it, and then they turned around and escaped back to Camp 354. I need to look into this now. That's like a whole new thing. I had no idea that was going on in Kenya. Prisoner of war
is
like,
not an easy climb.
Hell no.
You're an escaped person. You don't have the facilities or the clothing or anything that you need in order to climb Mount Kenya.
Yeah, but you think it's all tropical in Kenya until you decide to go up, Kilimanjaro or Mount Kenya. It doesn't work. But I mean, I need Mike. Have you heard about that story? I'm gonna have to dig into this. This whole we want to go have a picnic on the mountain story in Mount Kenya. I would have to look it up because I didn't even think about a World War II escape. Was this World War II?
Lisa, even the wildlife in Kenya is not, you can't even leave that out because you might be out of prison, but now you're in the wilderness? I
don't know. I don't know what was going on, but
well, how are you going to get to Mount Kenya without going through the wilderness?
So I didn't even think. Yeah, this was 1947. Oh, the film The Ascent. There's a movie on it. No Picnic on Mount Kenya. There's a movie we can watch.
Okay,
cool. There it is. Hey, we did good on the Hollywood history here, Mike. Who knew today what we'd be talking about?
Oh, so it's an Italian prisoner of war camp in Kenya.
Mhm.
Near Nanyuki. Yeah.
So, why are the Italians getting locked up in prisoner of war camps?
Because I
know they did some crazy things in Africa, but I always thought it was the Germans. What was going on with the Italians?
Yeah, well,
Mussolini?
The Italians were still
huge.
Our enemy during World War II. It was under the reign of Benito Mussolini, and so
that's right.
They had also declared war on us, and it was. Let's see, it was actually in 1943 that the Italian government proper capitulated, and Mussolini kind of took his regime into exile, and they continued to resist against the Allies until Mussolini ultimately met his demise, and then Italy was completely pacified and brought into the Allied fold. Early on, there were both Italian soldiers and Italian sailors that were captured and were brought to us as POWs. And this is actually another good segue for me to tell you about a chapter in Combat Diaries, because one of the gentlemen whom I interviewed was a PT boat veteran, and I think most people tend to associate PT boats with being in the Pacific, but PT boats were very active in the Mediterranean as well. And a lot of the PT squadrons found themselves ferrying OSS members and Allied spies to the Italian mainland, and also had some gun battles with the Italian Navy, because both the Germans and the Italians, they had their own version of the PT boat. And, very often throughout the Mediterranean theater, it became a battle of the competing PTs, because you would have American PT boats, that were firing torpedoes and, trying to blow up the Axis PT boats at the same time.
Wow. So I had no idea about it. I did know.
You have to watch the PT 109 movie, Lisa.
Oh, we're back to movies again. Wow.
Well, yeah.
So I can't wait. Combat, you need to get this. Can't you get it out sooner? Like, come on. I can't wait to read it. Well, I love it because you always bring in, look at all the books, Hal Moore and, Paul Gorman and, just everybody you've documented. You bring their story to life as, human beings in war and what they were going through. And I think it's so important that you're telling everybody stories, and because otherwise people will pass on and not tell, everything. Mm-hmm. And I think, people feel comfortable telling you, you've been in the military, you've served a number of years, and I think it's so important what you're doing. And it's not just an audience of those who have served in the military or the armed forces that get it. I know you have a huge following of, military folks, men and women, but I think also for all of us who have not served, it brings it home for us, and, so that we understand the amount of respect that needs to be given, and which is huge, right? And just these stories have to be told, and these stories also help bring peace and understanding, instead of lines being drawn. So I'm excited about your next book, The Combat Diaries, because it's important,
mm-hmm.
the men and women. And I love that you always bring women in, Mike. You're good at that too. You got to bring the women, because, who was the soldier that she cut her hair off, and was it the Civil War that went to fight? There's a woman. No, I have to look it up. And she ended up in Silver City, New Mexico.
Well, I know that there was a Buffalo soldier who did that. Her name was Kathy Williams, and she was able. Yeah, she was able to impersonate a man, and she joined one of the Buffalo soldier one of the Buffalo soldier regiments, and portrayed herself as William Kathy. Yeah.
That's right. That's her. She was in. So there's Fort Bayard in Silver City, New Mexico. Well, just outside Silver City in southwest New Mexico, and that's how we, found out about the Buffalo soldiers being there, and about her. And so she was there, and to this day they have. I don't know if the hospital's still there, but the fort is there, and they've tried really hard to preserve it. And it's quite. It's you're out in the desert Southwest, and then you go there, and it's like this whole compound, of what happened way back when. And especially with the Buffalo soldiers. So I always think of her. We'll have to do something on her next, too. We have a lot to do, apparently, So now, Mike, everywhere we go, we're going to be looking for POW camps. And apparently Texas, I don't know what happened, but I clicked on something, and there's like a whole PDF book done by universities with POW camps all over Texas. Like, apparently they were busy.
The Southwest, like parts of California and Texas, all had
Arizona.
POW. Yeah, they all had POW camps.
Was it mostly the West, or were there a lot back east? Just so we can plan as we go back, when we go back east, to look out there too, or is it just all across the country?
Most of the ones that I'm familiar with are concentrated in the West, and but they're I know that there's at least a few of them that are elsewhere throughout the country.
It's a whole new thing, Mike. We'll be out there. So everyone, every first Monday we chat with Mike Guardia. A lot of times it's on Zoom, but we decided, hey, let's, we're doing our live shows. It's still part of our anniversary year. And so we're having a nice blend, if I get to use that word, of live and recorded shows. We air daily, can keep up with us at bigblendradio.com. And again, keep up with Mike at MikeGuardia.com. His new book, Combat Diaries, will be out March 25th. And also follow him on the History Channel and watch him on I Was There. He's on different episodes. And I know the two is Johnstown Flood and Chernobyl. And so we're waiting for more, and we're excited about it. You can go to history.com to look that up as well. It's a great series. You really feel like you're there and understanding what happened, account by account. So good stuff. Mike, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure, as always.
All righty. Well, thank you, ladies. Always a pleasure to be on the show.
Oh, thank you. And always teaching us. And I can't believe I forgot about Mussolini. I feel like an idiot. I'm like, yes, duh, that was that time frame. I forgot.
Remember that
Hitler
dude?
Always overshadowed. Well, Hitler overshadowed Mussolini for a bit, right? And so talk about the two ego powers going off. But
yeah.
How did Mussolini die? I remember, didn't him and his wife, was it a car accident, or did they get their heads cut off or something? Remember it being kind of grim, like the two of them or something got killed. Do anybody remember how they died? I'm just being gross.
They were executed.
Yeah.
Oh, there it is. Okay, so off with their heads. That sounds horrible. But yeah, it is. Okay. Well, he was evil. He was not a good person. Not at all. Not at all. No. All right. Thanks so much, Mike. Everyone, take care. We'll be back tomorrow airing. Our next show is actually continuing on with women's history. We talk about women in travel and travel writing and tourism with 4 travel writers. Talking about women around the world and their travels. And what's interesting is half of them were talking about going to Russia this year. I don't think that's going to happen, unfortunately. So anyway, take a listen again tomorrow. Thanks, everyone. Take care, and see you soon.